The Penre Papers. A Journey Through the Multiverse. The Second Level of Learning. http://wespenre.com. Genesis Paper Number 4, The Beginning of a Tyranny by Penre, Saturday, August 18, 2012. Revised, Sunday, September 23, 2012, http://wespenre.com. 1. Terra Nova. Lord Enki was a master geneticist, perhaps the best in the Aryan Empire, trained directly under his mother, Queen Nekht. He had been on many planets that still hadn't developed any life forms, and was used to toxic atmospheres and rocky deserts. Perhaps 1,000,000 Earth years, or more, had passed since the War of the Titans and the destruction of Tera, and now Enki, as a skilled scientist, was sent by his stepfather, King Anu, to explore the destroyed planet to see if anything could be rebuilt on it. Eventually, what was left of the giant planet Tera had been catapulted towards the Sun due to the impact of the explosion, and one piece was relatively intact and had been taken up by the gravity from Mars and Venus and put itself in orbit around the Sun, right between the two smaller planets. Tera, which once had been quite giant, was now only slightly bigger than Venus. The other part of the old Tera had become the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. But not only that. When Tera exploded, Mars' atmosphere was sucked out in space as well, and lots of people died there, too. All that was left was a thin atmosphere that no one could breathe. Contrary to Tera, Mars was never rebuilt and reseeded, but once things started taking off again on Tera, Mars was repopulated as well, but only by Sirians, who built a science and a military base under Mars' surface. We have learned from many good sources that Mars was used also for genetic experiments, which continued underground after the depletion of her atmosphere. A skeleton crew of Sirians and their helpers are supposedly still there up to this very day. Enki rarely traveled in the Sirians' hollowed-out craft, unless he traveled together with them. Now he was alone in a new solar system, and this was the first time he was on Tera. He had heard so many stories about how beautiful it used to be here, and about his mother's, the Queen, experiment with the living library and the creation of the Enlil. Now, however, that all seemed to be gone. Tera was without atmosphere, and the trees, lakes, rivers, and oceans had been sucked out in space. Tera was a barren planet. Enki nano-traveled to Tera and could quickly browse the whole planet from a soul perspective and thus get a pretty good picture of how bad it was and what needed to be done. If he had had a body, he would have sighed, it would take time to rebuild this planet, but it was definitely possible. First thing he needed to do was to recreate the atmosphere and the magnetic field around the planet. Gone was the living library and all that came with it. Enki could not build such a thing on his own, or together with his scientific team. It required participation of thousands upon thousands of evolved planets, although he knew, of course, how to seed plants and animals, and also how to create higher intelligent life forms. However, his mission was to first rebuild Tera so it could become inhabitable again. The Conner wanted his gold and minerals, and to be able for the Sirian workers to descend to the planet they needed a world with an atmosphere, and this required plant and animal life to create an ecosystem and a sustainable atmosphere. And Enki needed quartz in great quantities in order to create intelligent life. It was needed for the artificial wombs. After he had eventually rebuilt the atmosphere and the magnetic field, Enki let founders from near and far direct asteroids and comets towards Tera, asteroids which included specific DNA that would help recreating the life forms on the planet, and for a while the atmosphere was bombarded with space rocks. Enki selected a team of scientists and they settled down in an area of the planet that is today the eastern part of Siberia and started building laboratories high up on a mountain, where the earth met the sky, where there was a big lake. Here was where intelligent life was going to be seeded once the reconstruction of Tera allowed it. This was where the most powerful lightning storms occurred in the beginning of time. Normally, a seeding process that could take millions, sometimes billions of years, the king wanted to be completed as fast as possible. Enki's task was to accomplish that. After Tera was destroyed, the king had lost a lot of income from his mining projects. He knew it was not going to be as lucrative as it used to be with a big chunk of the planet torn to pieces, but if he was lucky, there was still a lot of resources to dig up. So Enki did what he could to speed up the panspermia process, and soon there was thunder and lightning in the air all over the planet, igniting the seeds of life, and the first rains started. The rains became heavier and heavier and oceans started filling up. Enki and his team left the planet for a while to let everything have its time to develop. When Enki and his scientists came back, they planted forests all over the world to help with building oxygen, and Mother Terra could start breathing with her own lungs again. Life was eventually developing in the oceans, and land animals started to reappear. Terra was slowly being revived. Enki had reconstructed Terra in record time, and Terra Nova, the new Terra, was born. Some say that the word Earth is actually a name honoring Enki, whose title later changed to Ea, the god of sweet waters, thus Earth. If this is true or not is open for discussion, but this is probably a good time for me to change the name of our planet in my own story from Terra to Earth or Terra Nova, in an interchangeable fashion. In addition, Enki had genetically engineered tall and strong reptilian bodies, which he had put in storage in big tanks on Mars, where they were kept in a dormant state. They were waiting to be transferred to Nova Terra to be remained hidden in underground caverns, put away and locked into a frequency slightly above the 3D density which held the Earth's signature. This way, the bodies would not be found by anybody, except by those they were meant for and had the frequency keys. When the Sirians arrived with their hollowed-out craft, themselves traveling in the nano-world, they would have perfect bodies they could use for their 3D experience, bodies that had been tested elsewhere on other planets the Sirians had conquered. Hence, these reptilian vessels were familiar to them. The king was very pleased and gave Enki his title, Lord of Earth. The planet was again full of life forms, but there was no living library anymore, and the Namlu shepherds were gone. Enki took a long vacation and returned to the stars and didn't come back in a few thousand years. Earth needed to adjust to the quick reconstruction, and different plants and animals needed to be able to be synchronized into this young ecological system. When he came back, everything was working just the way he had planned. Other creator gods were here when he returned. The Vegans had experimented with their own genes, created monkeys and apes which now contained their own genes, and even some Catatu Def from worlds in Orion and Ursa Major and Minor were here, experimenting with the new fauna and flora, and these creator gods, just like the Vegans, had added species to the ecosystem. Enki recognized them from the stars, because some of them manifested in their true form, while others must have formed their own bases somewhere in the solar system where they had their own laboratories, including bodies as storage, just like Enki had. Some were reptilians, others amphibian and humanoid species were here as well, such as the Vegans Zero. Enki didn't mind this, and the Catatu races knew to stay away from the Sirians when they arrived. Finally the day came when Enki returned to Sirius and informed the king that he could send over people to mine on Earth again. The atmosphere should now be just right, and the frequency of the planet sufficient to house Sirian workers. 2. Enki's encounter in the forest. Soon enough, the Sirian ships started appearing around Earth, and their domestic aircraft descended down on the planet. The expedition was led by Lord Enlil, Lord of the Airways, but he was also titled Lord of Command, being the commander of the mining project and basically in charge of the whole project Eridu, except for the scientific part, which was been given to Enki, who had to give power away to his stepbrother, something he found unfair, but nothing he could do much about. After all, he was Aryan and not Sirian. Enlil couldn't believe what his brother had managed to do. This new planet was almost as beautiful and also quite identical with the old Terra, although so much smaller. The atmosphere was perfect for the giant reptilian bodies they reanimated, the temperature warmer than it used to be, which was appreciated, but Enki said there would eventually be ice ages, it was inevitable. For once, the two brothers were on the same page, and Enlil greeted his brother with respect for what he'd accomplished. They celebrated and got drunk in Enki's residence, and the party lasted for quite a few days, until Enlil finally told his men that it was time to start working. More miners were on their way from Sirius. As soon as Enlil got a chance to settle down on Earth, he started building the grid system and sealed off the stargates that led into, and out from Earth. He also changed the frequency of the planet so it became invisible for other star beings who might want to come and explore. Lord Enlil thus had the sole power to decide who could enter and who could leave the planet. Well, almost. The grid, which was meant to keep star being out, was not perfect and had holes in it. However hard they tried, they could not seal Earth 100%. Lord Enki, the Aryan master geneticist, working with his father's crew, had done a great job, but not great enough. There was no living library. Hence, to both Lord Enki's, Lord Enlil's, and everybody else's surprise, new plants and animal species started showing up on Earth, seemingly from nowhere. Still, he was thrilled over what was being done by creator gods more skilled than him. He saw plants he'd only heard of before, and he ate them. Soon enough, he was taken into another state of consciousness, which he otherwise only could reach outside 3D reality. Rabbits with long ears hopped around outside his cabin, and he started setting out traps to catch them, because he would assume they tasted good. When he saw the apes, they caught his interest, and the scientist in him came to life. These could be genetically manipulated, he thought, to create an even more intelligent species. Some of them were just animals, but the vegans had been there while he was gone and had mixed their own genes with the big apes and managed to come up with Homo neanderthalensis and Homo erectus, none of them too clever, but the first smarter than the second. The vegans had never been able to complete their experiment, however, and left it unfinished, and the hominid apes were running free on the planet. Homo erectus was quite a bit taller than modern man, while Homo neanderthalensis was slightly shorter. Enki's dream had always been to create an intelligent star being which had the fire of the mother goddess in them, the way his mother had taught him when he was younger. She had done it with the Enlil, and to become a master geneticist of rank, he felt he needed to accomplish at least that. This was what he often sat and dreamed about on his porch outside his cabin, getting drunk on spirits. Lord Enki was quite pleased with the results he'd accomplished so far, but he had still been too young to contribute to the Enlil experiment, millions of years ago. By the time the War of the Titans was over, he and his half-sister, Ninhursag, generally called Nin or Ninki, were both graduated master geneticist. This means they were both founders and could build worlds from the tiniest one-cell amoebas to highly intelligent star races. Lord Enki was later being called Prince Ea here on Earth, and a prince he was. However, Prince Ea was never going to inherit neither the kingdom of Sirius nor the queendom of Orion, to his own dismay. The Sirian throne was reserved for Prince Enlil, who had pure Sirian blood and was a real son of the king. And in Orion, a male did never inherit the throne. His stepsister, whom he loved dearly, could of course not inherit any throne either, although she was a princess, daughter of King Anu, as it were. Only males sat on the Sirian, or any other Sirian-dominated, throne. By the time Enki arrived on Tera, Nin was both Enki's stepsister and consort. The Queen of the Stars had had great plans for her talented son and was hoping he would work with her in creating new worlds and new projects. She early on noticed his genius, and this was the reason why she had trained him so hard. Enki certainly didn't mind the lessons. However, there was a slight problem. In spirit, Enki was his stepfather's son. For some reason, especially when he grew up, he spent more time in the Sirius Empire than he did in Orion. He particularly spent a lot of time around his stepfather, King Anu. This way he came to know his stepbrother, Enlil, quite well, too. As young adults, they apparently went along fairly well, although they also had their disputes, which could be pretty heated. Enlil was a typical Sirian and as such was quite hot-headed. He was either in a pretty good mood, or in a murderous fury. Numerous were the times when the two brothers were fighting, more so in their adolescence, if there is such a thing in Orion. Enki was often the one who calmed Enlil down, and thus their awkward friendship continued well into adulthood. After the Titan War, the mining projects continued. It was business as usual, but the workers soon started protesting again, even louder this time, about long hours in the mines. This infuriated Enlil, and he let his guards and the mining supervisors whip the ones who dared to protest. Lord Enlil even rushed down into the mines at times, talking to the workers in fury. With his reptilian mock-up, his voice was magnified, like if he'd used a bullhorn. He didn't need any. This seemed to help for a while, but the tension down in the mines increased every day, and everybody down there knew it was going to explode soon. Many complained over what a slave driver Enlil was. It even got to a point where they rebelled against their boss and stormed his palace and almost killed him, and the Lord of Command had to hide in his abode in Nippur, Mesopotamia. Those working on the plantations were rebelling, too. Enlil immediately used his powerful crystals to contact his father back in Sirius and told him about the problem and asked to be removed. He wanted to come back home to Sirius and leave Earth for good. Anu got furious when he heard about this problem, because the production came to a halt and they lost income. Both Enlil and Enki were called back home to Sirius, and Nin came with them. Enki had heard about the situation as well, and had thought of a solution that could help his brother with the heavy task of keeping the miners happy. In addition, he could take advantage of the situation and find a reason to accomplish his dreams. He and Ninhursag suggested they create a slave race who could do the job for the Sirian miners and hence relieve and discharge them and allow them to return to Sirius again after thousands of years of mining. This idea also forced Enlil to remain on Earth, something he was not thrilled about. So the two siblings traveled back to Earth to see what they could do, having King Anu's consent. Anu also liked the idea of having Enlil away from Sirius, because there was always a chance Enlil would overthrow him and take over the empire. Enki built a second house in a beautiful, wooden area of Earth, in what was to become his residence in a place called Eridu, and his shrine was Eabzu. Every morning he set his traps to catch wild animals he could eat, something he'd learned in Sirius. The traps were not of the kind that wounded the animal, but had treats inside a box-like construction, which attracted the victim, and the trap shut down behind it. However, every time Enki came back to get his prey, the traps had been opened and the prey was gone. First he thought it was one of the Sirian workers who had stolen his food because they were hungry, and he complained to Enlil. However, Enlil said that he kept a close eye on his workers after they left the mines late at night. He was afraid of gatherings, which could lead to rebellion, and no worker had ever come close to Enki's house. If this was true, Enki was clueless, so he asked Enlil if he could borrow one of his cameras that he used to monitor the workers, and his brother gave his consent. Enki set up the camera, well hidden in a tree close to one of the traps, and went home for the evening. The next morning, when he returned as usual, the trap was empty and clearly broken into, which meant that an animal must have been captured and then released by somebody. Enki was excited to find out who had stolen his meal, so he brought the film home to his Eabzu and ran it through his computer. He saw a rabbit swallowing the bait and get caught in the trap. Only a few minutes later, a tall and slender humanoid appeared by the trap. Without looking around, this strange, naked creature, Enki noticed it was androgynous but was still transmitting feminine energies, bent down, opened the trap, lifted out the animal and took it in her arms and held it as to comfort it. To Enki's surprise, the rabbit didn't seem scared in the arms of this wondrous humanoid, but calm, and like a mistreated child, it clung to her. It seemed like the humanoid communicated to the rabbit telepathically and gave it a lot of love. Then she set the rabbit down, whereafter it jumped into the woods and disappeared. The humanoid stood up, carefully opened a few branches of the tree in front her and found the camera. She stared into it, as if she'd never seen one before. Then she turned around and gracefully disappeared back into the woods. The Prince of Orion was surprised. He pushed a couple of buttons on his computer and ran the film again. He was quite fascinated by this unusual being. He had heard about the Namlu, the ones the Sirians called the Lu, from both his mother and people in Sirius. Now, when he'd seen them in real life, he was mighty impressed, as a geneticist in particular. His mother, the great Queen Nekht, had called them her masterpiece, and now he started to understand what she meant. How on earth do you create a being like that? Enki's creative and artistic mind began to work, and in his head he calculated how his mother must have put the cells together in a certain structure, and some ideas how it was done came to the young prince's mind. But more than all that, he was very surprised. Where did the Lys come from? He didn't put them there, and when he arrived at Tera, she was dead and barren. The only explanation was that some Lys had survived by fleeing underground before the great Ar hit Tera and split it in two. That made Enki wonder if there were more creatures who had survived. The truth of the matter was that many Namlu indeed had escaped underground, assisted by the few titans that survived the impact which destroyed old Tera. When Enki had restored the flora and the fauna on the planet, the original humans had remained underground. There was nothing for them up there, because the living library was gone, and the Namlu's task was to guard the living library. However, the Titans told them to bide their time. And they were right. Founders of a very high rank had suddenly penetrated the grid, moved through the corridors of time and inserted the living library again. As soon as the Namlu found out, they left the caverns in droves and went out on the steppes, savannas, and into the forests to herd the new animals. The Titans, however, remained underground. Enki was very excited, and thought that if he could capture one of these creatures, he could take cell and DNA samples from her and use in his own experiments. But first he needed to study the species in theory, so he looked them up on one of his Me-Def to find out more about them. Luckily for him, his mother had trusted him with the information and put it on his Me. After had studied them in detail, a plan started taking form in his head. With time, it became clear for both Enki and Enlil that quite a few of the Lys had survived the impact and had come up from underground. They were walking the forests and savannas of Earth, trying to take on their task once again to herd the animals. However, they were shocked when they noticed that the animals on this new world did not act and react the same way as they had done on the old Tera. These animals were of a lower consciousness and ate each other. Many of them ate meat. To the Namlu, this was unacceptable, and they tried to communicate with them, but they were not as responsive as they used to be, and the tall humanoids did not succeed in changing their behaviors, realizing they were not made to survive on light, grass, and plants only. Discouraged, they turned to the herbivorous animals and herded them, protecting them from the meat-eaters. This, of course, was a fruitless project, but herding and guarding the library was what the Namlu were once designated to do, and although they had all the power to change their destiny, being the interdimensional species they were, their love for nature was immense. And they could no longer communicate back to Orion, thus being stuck with what they had. In fact, when Enlil had tampered with the electromagnetic field of Terra Nova, it also had changed the behavior of the animals. They had lost their ability to absorb light and use it for food, and were now forced to eat each other. This was the beginning of the end for the gracious Namlu. 3. Pact between Enki and Enlil. The first mining projects were starting in what is today's South Africa, later extended to South America, and then to other parts of the world. The Sirians were looking not only for gold, but also other precious metals as usual. There were more planetary bodies in the solar system besides Earth which were hoarding precious metals and minerals, and soon enough the Sirians were digging on other planets in our solar system as well. Up to this day, the Sirians have bases on the Moon, Mars, the moons of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. There are indications that they even have bases on Venus. It was a hard task for Lord Enlil to keep the miners in check, not only on Earth, but on the other planetary bodies as well. He hardly got any sleep and worked around the clock to keep workers from revolting. And the more he had to interfere, the more furious he became. The situation was unbearable for everybody involved. Enki and Nin were working hard in the laboratories in Siberia and in the underground facilities on Mars to create a species his brother could use in the mines. Enki made a pact with his brother: if they, Enki and Nin, could create a race of humanoid which were strong enough to work in the mines, they agreed to produce them and give them to Enlil, on the condition that Enlil treated them well, and let them just be what they were supposed to be, workers. Enlil agreed, relieved to hear that his nightmare would perhaps soon be over. Enki, Nin, and their team of helpers, some of them Vegans, tried out prototype after prototype and then abandoned them. Nin was sometimes ruthless with eradicating the prototypes they didn't like or didn't work, and utterly destroyed the bodies, because she didn't want to leave any traces of the failures. Enki, on the other hand, had a much harder time doing this and worked with precision not to make too many mistakes. Still, it was impossible not to, and he thought to himself that this was the part of the job he liked the least. Some of the prototypes, like the centaur, half man, half horse, was tried out in the mines to carry bags of gold from the caves and up the elevators to the surface, but were discontinued. They tried minotaurs with bulls' heads and human bodies, but they couldn't do the job either. Finally, after an endless amount of experiments, they crossed the genes of the Homo neanderthalensis, possibly with that of the Namlu and a couple of other star races, but didn't want to use Sirian genes, as it would probably insult the overlords. There had been some suggestions that Enki should use Homo erectus to create the slave worker, but Enki had just frowned upon it and said that they were way too stupid. He refused to use them in his experiments. The Neanderthals were social, quite smart, and also more spiritual in nature than the erectus. Little did Enki know at that time that Homo erectus was eventually going to be used to create Homo sapiens. Enki and Nin took their prototype to a council meeting and showed the beast to King Anu, who at the moment resided on Mars. There were also other star races in alliance with the Sirians in the solar system at the time, such as races from Draco, Zeta Reticuli, and even some Vegans, who had broken up with Orion and allied themselves with the Dark Lords. So there was quite a crowd when the two scientists presented their product. King Anu stepped out of his chair and approached the beast. He squeezed the muscles in the black skin of the beast's arm, checked out the muscles all over the body and looked deep into his eyes. He also noticed to his satisfaction that this prototype was asexual. Then he returned to his seat and sat quiet for a while. Enlil broke the silence, saying he didn't like it. It seemed too smart and that in combination with its strength that could be devastating. He wanted a race which was easier to handle, not harder. Anu nodded his head. He said he liked the body type, it was perfect for work, both in the mines and on the huge plantations, and to dig for quartz as well. Anu knew that Enki and Nin needed quartz, lots of quartz, for the artificial wombs they were using when experimenting with genetics. Fortunately, that existed in abundance on Nova Terra. However, Anu continued, I want you to reduce the brain cavity of the beast and make it more stupid. When I looked into its eyes, I noticed intelligence there. Does he have genes from the Lus? If he does, I don't want that. The Lus can aimlessly wander around on the steppes, I don't care, but I sure don't want their consciousness in my workers. Enki felt quite offended and didn't want to create a stupid race, or they could just as well take the erectus and use them instead, like the Vegans had done. Still, he knew he couldn't say that, so he went back to the laboratories in order to manipulate their creation. He and Nin reduced the brain cavity and the two decided to use some genes of a race from the Draco system, who were a reptilian hominid worker species, strong and quite obedient, used to following orders. To accomplish a downgrade like this was nothing extraordinary, it was done all the time when genetically manipulating animals that show too much consciousness. Also, the vegan geneticists did it all the time when they manipulated the apes, they didn't want them to show too much awakening for their taste. Nin, however, had much less respect for the consciousness involved than Enki had, and she had no problems just killing off inappropriate prototypes. To her, just like to Enlil, as we shall see. Killing off experiments was not harder than to step on a bug, apparently. This new prototype was immediately approved by the Sirian Council and put on trial. This version was stocky, black-skinned and had big hands. They were made to work. 100 beasts were put to labor in the mines to observe how the beast reacted to commands and how well she performed. I say she, because the beast was still androgynous, just like what the Sirian overlords wanted. Being asexual made them more docile. It worked out per the plan, and even Enlil started accepting them, although he was a little reserved for a long time. So, Enki and Nin used their artificial wombs in their laboratories to create more bodies. An ethical question arose, however. Which souls would like to take the bodies of all these workers? Who wanted to be a worker in the mines and on the plantations? Nin said that the answer was simple. The planet was surrounded by a grid and was locked in, but there were still discarnate souls hovering around within the planet's atmosphere and had been since the planet was isolated, and these could be used to begin with. Enki agreed, at least for the moment, because he had other plans as well. 4. Lady of the Lake. All seemed to go well for quite a while, and eventually the Sirian workers in the mines and plantations could be released and were allowed to go home. Left were just the beast, whom Enki and Nin called the APA. However, one day Enki traveled to the mines to see how his creation was doing and was shocked to see how badly they were treated. Lord Enlil had no respect for the APA and drove them to their limits and whipped their black bodies bloody. Many of them died and others were in a terrible shape. Enki was furious and told Enlil that this was not what they had agreed upon. Enlil defended himself by saying that he needed to meet his quota and these stupid beasts were supposed to be able to meet them. So if they were too lazy to meet them, he had to make them. Enki threatened to stop producing workers if Enlil didn't change his attitude, but the Lord of Command said that these beings were just animals anyway, so who cares? And King Anu wouldn't be too pleased if the production stopped because Enki didn't want to produce more workers, especially now, when Sirian workers had left Nova Terra. Enki had probably never been this furious in his whole life before and left Enlil's office before he did something he would regret. He returned to his laboratory and sat down to think. His hands were tied, he felt obligated to produce slave workers who would be treated worse than any animal would. I can't say that I understand all the moral aspects of Enki and how his thought process really went. Albeit, I can still speculate from studying the consequences of his decisions. At this exact point in time, one would think he could just pack his bags and go somewhere else, to another planet, and continue his research there, where his oppressive brother didn't have any influence over him, and King Anu couldn't command him. After all, he was Aryan, not Sirian. Was it his marriage with Nin Hersag which made him stay? Her being Sirian and wanting to accomplish what her father wanted her to do, and Enki's apparent affinity for his stepfather, could that have something to do with that he decided to proceed past this point? We can only guess, but Lord Enlil consumed slaves faster than Enki and Nin could clone them. This was a full-time job for a whole team of scientists, and they still couldn't catch up, because Enki did not have the equipment to work any faster. So, instead of figuring out how to speed up the cloning process, he realized that the solution must be to let their creation reproduce sexually and introduce polarity onto the scene. Enki returned from Mesopotamia, where he had been working for a while, to the high mountain in Siberia, upon which the sky met the earth and there was this gorgeous, deep and clear blue salt water lake. This is where he set up his laboratory, and this time he was alone to begin with. It was time for him to accomplish his dream to create a sexual human being which had the fire of the mother goddess, from the depth of the Khaa. He wanted to insert this special divine fire into the sexual feminine body he wished to create. This place that he'd chosen was not random. Up here was where all the elements met. It was extremely electrical, with constant thunderstorms and incredible lightning bolts penetrating land and water. So one night, when the elements were all loose, Enki stood out in the rain and directed the lightning bolts to hit the lake, one after the other. The electricity was incredible, and when the lake was charged to the maximum, the Aryan master geneticist took samples of the water and took them to his lab. He had huge quantities of quartz available, and his crystals and his me were there with all the information to guide him, including everything he'd learned from his mother, the Queen of Orion. Outside, the thunderstorms continued in the same furious manner. And there she was, the Lady of the Lake. The first sexual human female, created by Enki's own DNA, but also that of the Lus, Sirians, Homo neanderthalensis, and a few other star races. But the most important thing of them all, she had the fire of the mother goddess. She was the Eve, the first genetically engineered sexual human female. Lord Enki was very pleased. The Eve was beautiful and dark-skinned, just like her asexual cousins. Excited from his success, Enki continued his work to genetically alter the Eve in order to create a manipulated female by adding lots of testosterone among other things. This manipulated female became the Adamus, the first sexual male. Enki let the two copulate, which failed in the beginning, but after a few adjustments, the two could reproduce and got offspring. And all of them had the fire of the goddess. However, the female bodies, as it were, had generally more spiritual and psychic abilities than the male, which is true even today. Don't we still say that females have better intuition than men? There is truth to that. The first time I heard the story of the Lady of the Lake in the above fashion was on Robert Morningsky's website, but the story is also backed up by the Pleiadians on many accounts. Here they say, your hypothalamus regulates the temperature and water in your body. You are water, you understand electrified water. The elements and balance of ocean water match the blood in your human body. Humans were made from the ocean. This is one of the greatest secrets of creation. What is this dam? It is all of the ideas, structures, and belief systems that hold the waters of consciousness together. You are made from water, dear friends. And the water in our bodies also is responding to our emotions, so I guess we can assume that via our hypothalamus, we can regulate and control our own emotions. Dan Winter also says in his, The Return of Enki, kids become stars. Imagine you are Enki learning from a dragon queen mother, Aid. Here sun is how you create life, take lightning, and learn to tie it up in a ball. Something about that first dimple which turns the skinny tornado like lightning bolt into the torus donut, is when the whip cracks, implosion starts, it becomes self-reentrant and self-organizing. And fiat lux, you have life itself. What was a lightning bolt, now appears like a floating ball, really toroidal. Scientists spent lifetimes studying the nature of ball lightning, never imagining that the answer required understanding the origin of life itself as a symmetry turn inside out. This is powerful information, because it's how the fire is made. The fire looks like an orb, and when attaching to a 3D body, she, the feminine orb, stretches herself out to form an avatar, or a light body around the physical one. Have you ever wondered what these orbs are that some people manage to catch on film, but were not there before the photo was taken? The lightning of the flash from the camera makes these dancing fires of consciousness visible, if they are present around the photographer. The legend goes that in a position between heaven and earth where the elements can be fully expressed, life can be created. The Pleiadians agree to what we've said here above as well, lightning being the force of the mother goddess. Enki was able to create, discover, and tie molecules together, encoding them with identity, frequency, and electrical charges in order to create life. Thus, Enki had created a fire that did not only come from the universe around him, but was created directly from the womb of the Khaa, the mother goddess. Thus, this fire had divine origins. By separating this fire and mixing the molecules together in a way only a very skilled Katato could do, Enki created mind and personality, and all this could be embedded into this new, sexual version of humankind. This fire had the same origin as that of the Namlu, whose genes he also used to create the vessels for this powerful fire. Each fire, stemming from its own oversoul of fire, was then split into many fragment, each one as big and powerful as the other. It was like having a lit torch, and then using it to light up another torch. Once the fire takes on, it's still as powerful as the fire of the first torch. Because of the manner in which Enlil and his Sirian team had locked the planet into 3D and linear time, Enki spread these fire fragments out over the vistas of time, so each fire could have more than one experience. Enki knew that each vessel would die in a certain amount of years and the fire would leave the body and be recycled, but by also being fragmented over a long time period, the Oversoul, the real you, would have a greater experience, was Enki's thoughts. This was Enki's experiment, which I want to call Project Elohim from here on. Only problem was that the Oversoul is waiting and waiting, but almost no fragments are reporting back to her, because her fragments are stuck here. It's like having a huge mother fish in one aquarium and putting all its baby fish in another. When the baby fish grow up and die, they can't go back to the mother fish, assuming that was the purpose, because the walls of the aquarium are in the way. Sometimes a fire fragment or two slip through the grid and can return to the Oversoul, but it's rare. Most fragments go back into the light, the tunnel, get implanted with amnesia and false memories and get shot down to Earth in a new body again. Now, however, during the nanosecond of 1987 to 2012, we have the chance to heal along the lines of time, like I described in the solution section of Level I, and that will eventually be the end of recycling/reincarnation. Once a fire fragment gets it and can escape after body death, the grip of the Sirian overlords can't keep her trapped anymore. She is free to return, and if she has worked on herself spiritually, she can bring the other fragments with her, or let them complete their cycle. Once all soul fragments have reported back to the Oversoul, the being is whole again and can continue her journey by doing whatever she wants. This is why it is so important to work on our own spiritual growth and healing, or we'll not be able to complete the cycle at this time. Much more about this in upcoming papers. What Enki apparently didn't think about when he spread out the fire fragments of the Oversouls was that the fragments would be stuck here and recycled and not able to reconnect with its higher self, due to the Sirian entrapment. It often seems like Enki was sometimes only thinking in the moment, without first checking out the consequences of his actions. An explanation to why this happened could be because here on Earth it was harder to reach out across the dimensions, like both Aryans and Sirians were used to do, this being due to the heavy density Earth was embedded into, and even the gods were trapped here due to Enlil's grid and the closing down of the stargates. But with a little effort he could have done it and seen that his creation was bound to go through a whole lot of suffering on many levels before they could set themselves free, if ever. Eventually, he seems to have realized this, but then it was too little, too late. His solution to this problem, as we shall see later, was not that brilliant either, and some would say it only made matters worse.